My daughter-in-law thought she was discarding a broken old woman when she hissed at me to stop sniveling and leave the house I built with my own hands. The dirt was fresh on my son's grave, and she was already checking her watch. She believed she had won a 3-bedroom ranch, but she had no idea she just declared war on the silent owner of half the real estate in this city. Grief can break you, or it can sharpen you into a blade. My name is Eleanor Hartman, though most people in this town just call me Ellie. I am 68 years old, and until this morning, I defined myself by the family I had built. I live in a suburb of Riverton, Ohio, a place where the winters are long and the memories are long, too. Today, I did the most unnatural thing a mother can ever do. I watched a bronze casket lower into the frozen ground, taking my only son, Jacob, with it. He was 43 years old. The official report said it was a sudden heart attack, a massive coronary event that took him before he hit the floor. But as I stood there, clutching my coat against the biting wind, I knew in my gut that something was wrong. Jacob was strong. He owned a busy auto repair garage and spent his days lifting heavy engine blocks and maneuvering under chassis. He had no history of heart disease, no high blood pressure. He was healthy, and then, simply, he was gone. The wind at Riverton Memorial Cemetery was merciless, whipping across the open fields and stinging my cheeks. But the chill I felt came from somewhere deeper. I looked around the gravesite. Friends, neighbours, and customers from the garage stood with heads bowed, genuinely grieving. And then there was my daughter-in-law, Tessa. She stood slightly apart from me, wearing a black dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than a funeral, coupled with oversized designer sunglasses that hid her eyes completely. I watched her, waiting for a tear, a tremble, a sign that she had lost her husband. There was nothing. While the pastor recited the final prayer, I saw the pale blue light of her smartwatch illuminate her face. She was checking her messages. A moment later, I saw her thumb tapping furiously on her phone screen, hidden discreetly behind her leather clutch. I watched her from the corner of my eye, feeling a distinct sickness rising in my throat. This was the woman Jacob had defended so many times. He would always tell me that Tessa was just misunderstood, that the high-pressure environment at Topline Crest Realty made her tense. I had bitten my tongue for years because I wanted my son to be happy. But looking at her now, standing dry-eyed over his grave, I realized she was not stressed. She was bored. After the service, the mourners gathered at the house on Maple Junction. My husband and I had built this single-story ranch with our own hands 40 years ago, laying the bricks and framing the walls ourselves. When Jacob married Tessa, I insisted they move in, telling them that this house would always be their home. I took the small guest suite in the back, happy to help them save for their future. The house was filled with the smell of casseroles and brewing coffee as neighbours hugged me, murmuring words of comfort that I could barely hear over the ringing in my ears. While I sat in the armchair, dazed and heartbroken, I noticed Tessa was not acting like a grieving widow. She was not greeting guests or accepting condolences. Instead, she was circling the room like a shark. I saw her open the china cabinet, run her finger along the antique silver, and then type something into the Notes app on her phone. She paused in front of the oil paintings my husband had collected, studying them with a cold, calculating stare. It felt like she was conducting an inventory rather than hosting a wake. By 5 o'clock, the last neighbour had left. The silence that descended on the house was heavy and suffocating. I stood up, my legs trembling, wanting nothing more than to retreat to my room, close the door, and finally let myself fall apart. I walked toward the hallway, but Tessa stepped directly into my path. She reached up and pulled off her black fascinator, tossing it onto the side table. Her face was composed, her makeup flawless. She looked at me with eyes that held zero warmth. "Stop sniveling," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of emotion. "You are leaving tonight." I blinked, certain that the grief had caused me to hallucinate. I stared at her, mouth slightly open. Tessa did not wait for me to respond. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me toward the sofa. She snatched a leather folder she had been guarding all day and threw a stack of papers onto the coffee table. "Read it," she commanded. "It is a quitclaim deed." I looked down through my blurred vision. It was a legal document stating that Jacob Hartman was transferring full ownership of the property at Maple Junction to Tessa Hartman. My eyes found the signature at the bottom. It said, Jacob Hartman. But my breath caught in my throat. The signature was wrong. The lines were shaky and weak, and the letter J was looped in a strange way that Jacob never used. It looked like the writing of a man who was terrified or barely conscious. "This is my house now," Tessa declared, crossing her arms. "You have no legal right to be here. You can pack your things and get out immediately." I looked at the document, and then I looked up at the woman my son had married. The tears that had been threatening to spill over suddenly stopped. The crushing weight of sorrow in my chest began to cool, rapidly hardening into a thin, sharp layer of ice. "Jacob was drowning in debt," Tessa said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were doing me a favor by revealing my son's shame. She claimed he had used the house as collateral for a massive loan, and that if he had not signed the deed over to her, the bank would have foreclosed on us by the end of the month. I listened to her lies, and I felt my spine stiffen. I knew the books. I had given Jacob the seed money to open his garage, and I sat with him every quarter to review his profit and loss statements. My son was conservative with money. He paid his vendors on time. He had zero debt. Tessa leaned in closer, her perfume cloying and sweet. She told me that if I did not clear out my things tonight, she would call the police. She said she would report me as an intruder. She looked me up and down and said that the officers would believe a legal property deed over a crying old woman. She expected me to panic. She expected me to beg for a few more days or to scream at the injustice of it all. I did neither. I sat there and let the silence stretch between us until she began to fidget. "When do you want me to go?" I asked. My voice was dry, like dead leaves scraping against pavement. Tessa blinked. She was prepared for a fight, not surrender. She recovered quickly, seizing the advantage. "Tonight," she said. "As soon as possible." She turned her back on me and walked toward the master bedroom, already acting like the lady of the manor, pulling out a suitcase for me to use as if she were being generous. I walked to my small room at the back of the house. I closed the door and knelt before the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. It smelled of lavender and the wool blankets I had knitted years ago. I pushed aside the linens and reached for the false bottom. There, resting in the dark, were two items that defined my life far more than the apron I wore in the kitchen: a battered leather notebook and a silver USB drive. Under the yellow light of the bedside lamp, my face changed. The lines of grief around my mouth hardened. The tears dried up. The mother who had just buried her son receded, and the woman who had built an empire from nothing stepped forward. I opened the leather book It was the Hartman ledger. It contained handwritten records of every property purchase and sale I had made over the last 30 years. Jacob knew I dabbled in real estate, but he had no idea of the scope. I was never just a housewife. For decades, I worked as a financial manager at Briarwick Health Systems. I lived on a fraction of my salary and used the rest to quietly buy distressed properties, fix them, and hold them. I packed a small duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes and my blood pressure medication. I tucked the ledger and the USB drive into the side pocket. Then I reached into the chest one last time and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. The label on the front read, Hartman Family Trust. I zipped the bag and walked out of the room. Tessa was standing in the living room, arms crossed, watching me. She looked at my small bag and smirked. I knew exactly what she was thinking. She thought I was heading out to wander the streets, a homeless old widow with nowhere to go. I stopped at the open door. The wind from the Riverton night bit at my skin. I turned back to look at the house I had built, and then I looked at the woman who thought she had stolen it. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Tessa, I said. I walked out into the cold and did not look back. I did not go to a shelter. I drove my old sedan to the Highway Star Motel near the interstate. It was clean and anonymous. When the clerk asked for a card for the room deposit, I did not hand him my personal debit card. I handed him a business platinum card issued to Maple Junction Holdings, LLC. Tessa had never heard of this company. She did not know that it was a shell company I controlled, or that through it, I owned the very land her real estate office stood on. Inside the room, I locked the deadbolt and sat at the small desk. I opened my ancient laptop and plugged in the USB drive. The screen glowed blue in the dim room. I opened the first file. It contained the direct private line for Monica Lane, the attorney who managed the Hartman Family Trust. It was late, so I got her voicemail. I held the phone tight, my voice steady and cold. Monica, it has begun, I said. Tessa just kicked me out of the house. I need you to activate the emergency plan tomorrow morning. The next morning found me sitting 20 floors above the city centre, staring out through a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. From the office of Monica Lane, Riverton looked like a sprawling model train set. I could pinpoint the exact neighbourhoods where I had quietly bought run-down duplexes when I was young, fixing them up on weekends while working my day job. I looked down at the streets that held my secrets, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I was wearing my best Sunday suit, but I felt like a soldier putting on armour. Monica walked in, carrying a tablet and a steaming cup of black coffee. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, with heritage that spoke of Latin America and an attitude that spoke of the Ivy League. She was sharp, precise, and the only person in the world who knew the true extent of the Hartman estate. She sat down and didn't waste a second on pleasantries. She confirmed that every single piece of real estate, including the house on Maple Junction, had been transferred into the Hartman Family Trust over 12 years ago, right after my husband passed. The public records might still list the Hartman family name to keep things simple, but the actual legal ownership belonged to the trust. She tapped her tablet, and a large screen on the wall flickered to life. It displayed a high-resolution scan of the quitclaim deed Tessa had thrown at me the night before. Monica zoomed in on the signature until the ink strokes looked like jagged roads. She pointed out the tremor at the end of the letters and the hesitation marks where the pen had lifted off the paper. She told me that it looked like the writing of someone under extreme duress or someone whose motor functions were failing. It was either a forgery or a coerced signature. Then she dropped the real bomb. She told me that even if the signature was 100% authentic, the document was worthless. Jacob could not sign the house over to Tessa because Jacob did not own the house. He was merely a beneficiary of the trust, not a trustee. He had absolutely no legal right to transfer property. Tessa had bullied a dying man into signing a piece of paper that had the legal weight of a napkin. I felt a wave of pain hit me, followed immediately by immense relief. My son had not betrayed me. He had not chosen her over me. Monica then swiped to the next slide, which was an email dated just 7 days ago. It was from Jacob. He had sent a photo of that very deed to Monica with a subject line that read, "Urgent." The message was short and confusing. He asked what the paper was because Tessa was pressuring him to sign it just to get her off his back. A memory flashed in my mind. It was the last phone call I had with Jacob. His voice had sounded so tired, so heavy. He told me he had to deal with Tessa and that he would come over for dinner the following week. He hung up before I could ask more. That following week never came. Monica leaned forward, her expression serious. She proposed 2 immediate steps. First, we would file a civil suit to evict Tessa for trespassing and attempting to defraud the trust. Second, and far more dangerous, we would petition the police and the coroner to reopen the investigation into Jacob's death. She said the financial motive was too glaring to ignore. I hesitated. I was terrified of being dismissed as a grieving mother who could not let go. But then Monica started listing the facts on her fingers. The forged deed. The frantic need to get me out of the house immediately. The talk of massive debt. The sudden heart attack in a healthy man. The email from Jacob. The pieces clicked together into a picture so dark it made me cold. Monica pressed a button on her desk phone and asked someone named Dean to come in. A moment later, the door opened. Dean Harper looked like a man who had seen everything Riverton had to hide. He was in his 50s, wearing a rumpled jacket, with the watchful, cynical eyes of a former homicide detective. He shook my hand, his grip firm and dry. I looked at him, and then I looked at Monica. I knew there was no turning back. I do not just want my house back, I whispered, my voice trembling with a rage I had never felt before. I want to know the truth about how my son died. Dean spread the paper trail of my son's life across Monica's glass conference table. It was a chaotic mosaic of invoices from the garage, bank statements, life insurance policies, and backups of emails from the laptop I had salvaged. I sat opposite him, my hands clasped tight to stop them from shaking. I had spent 40 years looking for financial discrepancies in hospital ledgers, spotting embezzlement in the margins of spreadsheets. So I knew what clean books looked like, and Jacob's books were spotless. Dean confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Jacob had a credit score near 800. He carried 0 credit card debt month to month. Hartman Auto and Repair was turning a steady profit, and there was absolutely no mortgage on the house because my husband and I had paid for every brick in cash decades ago. The story Tessa had spun about Jacob drowning in debt and using the house as collateral was a complete fabrication. A lie designed to make her urgency to sell seem rational. I closed my eyes, letting a memory surface that I had previously dismissed. I told Dean about the nights I visited and saw Tessa glued to her phone, the glow of the screen reflecting in her sunglasses. She would talk about parlays and odds, terms I did not understand at the time. I remembered seeing a notification flash on her screen once when she left her phone on the counter. It read that she was down $10,000 and the deadline was the end of the month. When I asked Jacob about it, he just sighed and told me not to read his wife's messages. Dean typed furiously on his laptop, his eyes narrowing. Within an hour, he had traced the digital breadcrumbs. He found a secondary email address linked to Tessa that was flooded with notifications from offshore betting sites. Worse, he found chat logs with a user named Brick. Dean made a few calls and confirmed that Brick was a loan shark operating out of a pool hall on the edge of town, a man known for breaking fingers when payments were late. Tessa was not just stressed. She was in the hole for over $100,000, and the sharks were circling. While Dean dug into the dirt, Monica filed an emergency motion with the court to protect the assets of the Hartman family trust. She petitioned for an immediate eviction order against Tessa on the grounds of trespassing and fraud. Dean advised me not to return to the house yet. He said it was better to let the law handle the eviction rather than risking a confrontation that Tessa could spin for the cameras. Then Dean pulled up the medical report from the night Jacob died. He frowned as he read it. The cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest due to unknown causes, likely stress-related given family history. But there was no comprehensive toxicology screening. Dean pointed out that the attending physician in the emergency room that night was an old college roommate of Tessa's older brother. It was a connection that could be innocent, or it could explain why a healthy 43-year-old man was signed off as a natural death without a second look. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck as a specific memory hit me. 2 weeks before he died, Jacob had come over for dinner. He looked pale and kept rubbing his temples. He complained that the coffee at home had been tasting strangely bitter lately, no matter how much sugar he added. He said he had been feeling nauseous and dizzy for days. I had told him it was just the flu or exhaustion. I had told him to get some rest. I had sent him back to her. Dean leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. He looked at Monica and then at me. He proposed a step that made the air leave the room. He wanted to petition the medical examiner to exhume Jacob's body for a full toxicology panel. At the same time, he wanted to request a soft search warrant for the Maple Junction house to look for specific chemical residues. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the parking lot below. I gripped the sill until my knuckles turned white. I understood the gravity of what he was asking. If we did this, there was no going back. If I was wrong, I would be branded as the insane mother-in-law who desecrated her son's grave because she could not let go. I would be a pariah in this town until the day I died. But if I was right, the woman who was currently sleeping in my son's bed was a murderer. I turned back to them, my face set in stone, and gave the order to dig him up. While Monica, Dean, and I were meticulously assembling the legal framework to bring her down, Tessa was already trying to cash out. She wasted no time. She called a real estate broker from a rival agency, someone hungry enough not to ask too many questions, and listed the house on Maple Junction for a quick sale. She claimed the title had been legally transferred and that she was ready to close immediately. She was terrified of the debt collectors, and she needed the equity from my house to pay off the sharks circling her water. But her plan hit a wall the very next morning. Tessa was in the middle of giving a tour to the broker, likely pointing out the granite countertops I had installed, when 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb. The officers did not knock with the polite hesitation reserved for grieving widows. They banged on the door. They informed her that they were there to serve a notice regarding the illegal occupation of a property belonging to the Hartman family trust. Then, they delivered the second blow. They notified her that the investigation into the death of Jacob Hartman was officially being reopened due to new evidence. Tessa tried to bluster her way through it. She stood in the doorway, blocking their entry, and insisted that she was the legal owner and that Jacob had left everything to her. But when the officer held up the trust documents Monica had filed, pointing out that Jacob never had the authority to sign over the deed, Tessa turned the colour of ash. The broker, sensing a legal nightmare, excused himself and practically ran to his car. Tessa was left standing alone, realizing that the house was not the asset she thought it was. It was a trap. Cornered animals bite, and Tessa was no exception. She realized the law was not on her side, so she turned to the court of public opinion. She called a media lawyer and then reached out to Logan Price, a reporter for Riverton 7, who was known for turning family tragedies into primetime entertainment. She sold him a story that had been carefully edited to remove all her sins. That evening, I sat on the edge of my bed at the motel, staring at the television. Tessa filled the screen. She was wearing a simple white shirt that looked nothing like the designer clothes she usually wore. She wore no makeup, making her look young and vulnerable. She wiped away a tear and told the camera that her father-in-law had been a secret real estate tycoon and that her mother-in-law hated her because she was just a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. She painted a vivid picture. On one side, there was the powerful, wealthy mother-in-law with high-priced lawyers and secret trusts. On the other side, there was the penniless, grieving widow being thrown out into the snow. She did not mention the forged deed. She did not mention the $170,000 in gambling debt. She did not mention that Jacob was planning to divorce her. She just cried, and the city of Riverton cried with her. My phone started buzzing with notifications. Social media was exploding. People were sharing the clip with captions calling me a wicked witch and a heartless monster. There were calls to boycott Hartman properties, businesses people did not even know I owned until Tessa outed me. I felt the bile rise in my throat. I wanted to drive down to the station and scream the truth into a camera. I wanted to show them the betting slips and the fake signature. Monica stopped me. She put a hand on my shoulder and told me to stay silent. She explained that if I engaged with her in the media, I would be playing her game. Tessa wanted an emotional battle because she could not win a legal one. Monica told me to let her talk and let her dig her own grave. While the town debated whether I was a villain or just a bitter old woman, Dean was ignoring the noise completely. He was in the field, piecing together the final hours of my son's life. He secured the recordings of the 911 call from the night Jacob died. He pulled security footage from the garage, and most importantly, he found video from a gas station on the highway, time-stamped just hours before the cardiac arrest. Dean was not interested in who people felt sorry for. He was interested in the timeline of a murder. Dean Harper did not look at me with pity anymore. He looked at me like a partner in a hunt. He set his laptop on the desk and played a video file he had extracted from a security camera at Blue Star Fuel, a gas station 15 minutes from my son's house. The timestamp was dated 4 days before Jacob died. The footage was grainy, but the violence of the moment was clear. My son's truck was parked at Pump 4. Inside the cab, I could see Jacob screaming. He was not just arguing, he was enraged. He grabbed a thick stack of papers from the dashboard and threw them at Tessa. The white sheets flew everywhere inside the small cabin, fluttering like panicked birds. Tessa sat there, frozen, shrinking against the passenger door. Dean paused the video and zoomed in on the bottom corner of one of the papers pressed against the window glass. It was blurry, but the logo was distinct enough for Dean to run a match. It belonged to the law offices of Emily Novak, a fierce family law attorney in downtown Riverton. Dean did the legwork and found that Jacob had visited Emily 3 days prior to that argument. During that single appointment, he had signed 2 things. He signed a petition for divorce, and he signed a new will. Monica reached out to Emily, explaining the gravity of the situation. And by noon, we had copies. Reading them felt like watching my son speak from the grave. In the divorce filing, Jacob had been ruthless. He stated that the house belonged to the trust and that Tessa was entitled to nothing regarding the property. But the will was the real blow. It explicitly stated that in the event of his death, any and all personal assets were to revert to me, his mother. He had cut her out completely. Then Dean layered the financial motive on top of the legal one. He pulled up a spreadsheet of betting records linked to an account named Tessa H. She was not just losing, she was hemorrhaging money. She owed more than $130,000 to 3 different offshore sites. But the terrifying number was the $40,000 she owed to Brick Lawson. Dean described Brick as a man who preferred using a hammer on fingers to sending late notices. The timeline of the day Jacob died was a countdown to execution. Dean showed us the call logs. Tessa received 3 calls from Brick between noon and 4 in the afternoon. Immediately after the last call, her bank records showed she drained her checking account to 0, but it was not enough. At 5 o'clock, an automatic security alert was sent to Jacob's email. Someone had tried to open a new line of credit using his social security number, but it was instantly declined because he had frozen his credit years ago on my advice. Tessa was trapped. She had no money, a dangerous loan shark coming for her, and a husband who was about to divorce her and leave her with nothing. The final piece of the puzzle came from the ground. Under pressure from Monica and the compelling evidence Dean had amassed, the coroner's office had agreed to the exhumation. The toxicology report was preliminary, but damning. Jacob did not just die of a heart attack. His blood contained massive levels of warfarin, a powerful anticoagulant. It was not a therapeutic dose. It was a lethal accumulation built up over weeks. Dean placed a stack of receipts on the table. They were from a hardware store 3 miles from the house. Over the last 2 months, Tessa had purchased 4 boxes of Sure Stop rat poison. Dean had already interviewed the neighbors on both sides of Maple Junction. None of them had seen a rat in years. Finally, Dean played the audio analysis of the 911 call. To the untrained ear, Tessa sounded frantic, but Dean pointed to the spectrograph on his screen. There were long pauses of dead silence before she spoke. Based on the body temperature recorded by the paramedics and the timeline of the call, Dean estimated that Tessa waited exactly 20 minutes after Jacob hit the floor before she dialed the emergency number. She watched him die, and when she finally called, she repeated the phrase that he had a history of heart problems 3 times, planting the seed for the paramedics before they even arrived. Dean sat back and looked at us. The timeline was complete. The gambling debts came due. The loan failed. The divorce papers were thrown. The rat poison was administered. And the phone call was delayed just long enough to ensure he never got up. I sat in the silence of the office, listening to the hum of the air conditioning. I did not cry. I looked down at my hands and realized I was clenching them so hard that my fingernails had broken the skin of my palms, and a single drop of blood was running down my wrist. Monica took our war room findings to the Riverton district attorney, but the meeting did not go as smoothly as I had hoped. The DA was a political creature. and he was terrified of the narrative Tessa had spun. He looked at the toxicology reports and the timeline, but he hesitated. He told Monica that he needed something undeniable, something that would convince a jury even after they had seen Tessa crying on the evening news. He needed a confession, or at least an admission that shattered her credibility entirely. Dean sat at the end of the table and proposed a gambit that was as dangerous as it was brilliant. He suggested we use a civil lawyer to approach Tessa with a settlement offer that was too good to refuse. The terms were simple. I would drop all allegations of trespassing and allow her to keep the house, provided she signed an internal agreement admitting that the original deed was a mistake caused by a misunderstanding of the trust laws. Dean knew Tessa was desperate. Brick Lawson was breathing down her neck for his $40,000, and she needed clear title to the house to sell it and save her skin. The trap was set in a rented office suite downtown, wired for sound and video by Dean's team. Tessa arrived looking like a cornered animal, her eyes darting around the room. She sat across from the lawyer we had hired for the role. When the settlement was pushed across the table, she barely read it. She was so relieved to see a way out that she started talking. She admitted that the deed was not exactly legal. She told the lawyer that she had just done what her brother told her to do, and that he had even guided her hand to make the signature look as close to Jacob's as possible. She admitted to the forgery on tape, driven by the panic of her gambling debts. Then the lawyer dropped the hammer. He asked casually about the rat poison, mentioning that the trust administrators were concerned about the rumors regarding the coffee. Tessa did not cry. She exploded. She jumped out of her chair and screamed that no one could prove a thing. She yelled that Jacob was not a saint and that he deserved to be taught a lesson. She did not say the words, "I killed him," but her rage and her defensive shrieking were not the reactions of an innocent, grieving widow. It was the reaction of a narcissist who felt justified in her cruelty. Dean pulled the plug on the meeting immediately. We had enough. He handed the recordings to the DA, and Monica supplemented the package with a sworn affidavit from Emily Novak, the divorce attorney. Emily detailed how terrified Jacob had been during his final days, stating under oath that he had told her to give his new will to me if anything suspicious happened to him. The DA finally saw the full picture. He decided to bypass a preliminary hearing and took the case directly to a secret grand jury to avoid alerting the press for an entire day. I sat in Monica's waiting room, twisting my gold wedding band around my finger until the skin was raw. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I just waited. Late in the afternoon, the call came. The grand jury had voted to indict Tessa Hartman on charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances for financial gain. To prevent her from fleeing the state, the judge signed a sealed arrest warrant. While the legal noose was tightening, Tessa was still on her victory lap. She appeared on a local talk show that night, playing the role of the martyr perfectly. I sat in the dark of my hotel room and watched her. I took notes on every lie she told. I recorded every contradiction. Monica called it our perjury video library. Tessa looked into the camera and said she missed her husband more than anything in the world. I wrote down the time and the date next to the note about the rat poison receipts. Dean came to see me the night before the first civil court hearing regarding the house. He looked tired, but his eyes were burning with a grim satisfaction. He told me that tomorrow Tessa would walk into that courtroom with her lawyers and her reporters and her fake tears. He paused and looked me dead in the eye. He said that while she brings the circus, we are bringing a murder indictment carried by the state prosecutor. The Riverton County Courthouse was packed. I walked in with my head high, ignoring the whispers that followed me down the aisle. Tessa sat at the plaintiff's table, looking small and fragile in a tailored black suit. She clutched a tissue in her hand, dabbing at dry eyes. Beside her sat Carter Miles, a lawyer with a smile that looked like it cost more than my car. He was ready to carve me up. He had promised the press a show, and he intended to deliver one. The gallery was full. I saw Logan Price in the front row, his recorder poised to capture every moment of my public shaming. The narrative was set. I was the greedy, wealthy mother-in-law kicking the grieving widow onto the street. Carter Miles wasted no time in his opening statement. He paced in front of the judge, gesturing wildly toward me. He painted me as a ruthless landlord who hid assets behind complex trusts and was now exploiting the tragic death of my own son to seize property. He called me cold. He called me heartless. Behind him, Tessa let out a perfect, stifled sob that made half the room look at me with disgust. When it was Monica's turn, she did not raise her voice. She did not pace. She simply walked to the bench and submitted a thick binder of documents. Her argument was surgical. She explained that the house on Maple Junction had been the property of the Hartman Family Trust for over a decade. She presented the deed history, the tax records, and the trust bylaws. She stated clearly that Jacob Hartman was merely a beneficiary. He never held the title to the house, and therefore he had zero legal authority to transfer it to anyone. The quitclaim deed Tessa was waving around was legally impossible, regardless of whose signature was on it. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Holloway. She had stern eyes and a voice that demanded absolute silence. She looked over her reading glasses at Carter Miles. She asked him a simple question. She asked if he had any evidence, any at all, that Jacob Hartman held the title to the property after the trust was formed in 2012. Carter froze. He shuffled his papers, looking for a lifeline that did not exist. He stammered that the quitclaim deed showed intent, but Judge Holloway cut him off. She told him that intent did not override property law. She slammed her gavel and dismissed the case with prejudice. She stated for the record that the lawsuit was frivolous and bordered on an abuse of the court system. Tessa stood up, her face twisting in shock. She screamed that it was unfair, her voice shrill and ugly. Carter Miles turned red, gathering his papers as the reporters in the gallery began to murmur. But the show was not over. Just as the bailiff moved to clear the room, the district attorney stood up from the back bench. He was a tall man with a voice like gravel. He asked the judge for permission to address the court regarding a new matter concerning Mrs. Tessa Hartman. The room went deadly silent. Tessa spun around, her eyes wide with confusion and rising panic. The district attorney opened a leather folder and began to read. He announced that the grand jury had returned an indictment against Tessa Hartman for murder in the first degree. He detailed the charges, reading out loud that she was accused of intentionally poisoning her husband, Jacob Hartman, with the anticoagulant warfarin over a period of several weeks for the purpose of financial gain. Every word landed like a physical blow. The audience gasped. Logan Price dropped his pen. Two police officers who had been sitting quietly in the back row stood up and moved toward the front. The district attorney looked straight at Tessa and announced that they were executing an immediate arrest warrant. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Tessa backed away, knocking over her chair. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I had made it all up. She shrieked that I was the one who killed him. But the officers were already there. They spun her around and pulled her arms behind her back. For the first time in this entire nightmare, Tessa was not in control. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed through the room, louder than any lie she had ever told. The cameras flashed, capturing not a grieving widow, but a murderer in custody. The criminal trial began several months after the arrest, and the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from civil curiosity to heavy, suffocating tension. Tessa sat at the defense table, but the designer suits and oversized sunglasses were gone. She was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot, exposing the dark circles under her eyes. She tried to maintain the posture of a victim, keeping her chin high and her hands clasped. But every time the heavy door opened, she flinched. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like a trapped animal waiting for the cage to close. The prosecution wasted no time in dismantling the image of the innocent wife. The first major blow came from the medical examiner. He projected images of tissue samples onto the screens for the jury. He explained in a calm, clinical voice that the levels of warfarin found in Jacob's liver and kidneys were inconsistent with any accidental ingestion. He pointed out that the build-up suggested a chronic administration. He told the jury that this was not a one-time overdose. It was a slow, calculated process of poisoning that had taken place over weeks. A toxicologist took the stand next. She turned to the jury and explained exactly how warfarin worked. She described how it thinned the blood until it could no longer clot, leading to massive internal hemorrhaging that would feel, to the victim, exactly like a heart attack. She paused and looked directly at Tessa when she said that the killer likely chose this method specifically because it mimics natural causes, hoping to hide the crime behind a death certificate labeled cardiac arrest. Then Dean took the floor. He dimmed the lights and played the video from the Blue Star fuel station on the large monitors. The jury watched the silent, grainy footage of my son inside his truck. They saw the rage in his body language as he threw the stack of papers into Tessa's face. Dean froze the frame where the papers scattered in the air. He explained that those papers were the filed divorce petition and the new will. The video proved that Tessa knew she was losing everything. She knew the marriage was over, and she knew she had been cut out of his estate days before he died. Emily Novak, the divorce attorney, brought the voice of my son into the room. She sat on the witness stand and recounted her last meeting with Jacob. The courtroom was silent as she repeated his words. She testified that Jacob had told her he suspected his wife was scamming him out of money. She said he looked her in the eye and said that if anything happened to him, he wanted his mother to be protected. I sat in the gallery, gripping my purse, feeling the tears prick my eyes as I heard him trying to save me even while he was dying. The financial motive was laid out like a mathematical equation. The prosecution presented the betting records and the threatening text messages from Brick Lawson. They showed photos of Tessa arguing with Brick outside a dive bar on the edge of town. They put a number on the motive. Tessa owed $170,000, and the final payment deadline was just 48 hours after Jacob died. The jury could see the timeline clearly. She did not kill him for love or passion. She killed him to pay a gambling debt. The defense tried to salvage their case by attacking me. They called me to the stand, hoping to provoke the angry, vindictive mother-in-law they had described to the press. Tessa's lawyer asked if I had always resented Tessa for being from a different social class. He asked if I had ever called her a leech. I looked at him. Then I looked at the jury. I kept my voice steady and low. I admitted that we were not close, and that I did not approve of her spending habits. But I told them clearly that I never wanted my son to be divorced. I wanted him to be happy. I did not give them the anger they wanted. I gave them the grief they could not refute. In a brilliant countermove, the prosecutor played the clips from Tessa's media blitz. The jury watched Tessa on the courtroom monitors, looking beautiful and tearful in her television interviews, claiming that Jacob had left the house to her and that the papers were legal. Then, the prosecutor held up the forged deed and the divorce papers. Every time Tessa contradicted herself on screen, the jury looked more offended. They realized they had been played. After days of testimony, the defense had nothing left but a plea for pity. In his closing argument, Tessa's lawyer tried to paint her as a woman under extreme financial and psychological pressure, a desperate soul who made a terrible mistake, not a cold-blooded killer. He spoke of her fear of the loan sharks, but the prosecutor ended the trial with a single, chilling sentence. He walked over to the jury box, rested his hand on the railing, and said that financial pressure is not a justification for putting rat poison in your husband's morning coffee. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When the door to the deliberation room finally opened, the air in the courtroom seemed to vanish. I sat beside Monica, my hands resting on the table. Every sound felt distant, muffled by the pounding of my own heart. The foreman stood up. He looked tired but resolute. He unfolded the paper and read the verdict. Guilty. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Guilty on all counts. Tessa collapsed into her chair as if her strings had been cut. She turned her head and stared at me. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of horror and disbelief. She looked at the woman she had called a sniveling old wreck just months ago, finally realizing that I was the one who had brought her world crashing down. The judge asked if anyone from the victim's family wished to speak before sentencing. I stood up slowly. I walked to the podium, holding a small, framed photograph in my hand. It was not a formal portrait. It was a candid shot of Jacob laughing, holding a scruffy stray cat he had rescued from the garage. I placed it on the stand facing the room. I did not scream. I did not curse. I spoke to the silence. I told them about the little boy who used to sit cross-legged on the subfloor, watching me hammer nails into the hardwood. I told them about the man who was proud that his mother bought houses in neighborhoods that everyone else had given up on. I painted a picture of a man who built things, while the woman sitting at the defense table only knew how to destroy them. Then I turned and looked directly at Tessa. The courtroom went deadly quiet. My voice dropped, becoming as cold as the winter ground where my son now lay. I told her that Jacob had planned to forgive her. I told her that he had signed the divorce papers, but had decided not to report her fraud to the police. I told her that if she had just accepted the divorce, she would have lost the house and the money, but she would have kept her freedom. She could have started over, but she was too greedy to let go. Then I delivered the final blow. I revealed the truth that had been hidden in the ledgers she never bothered to read. I told the court that the Hartman Family Trust held assets valued at over $15 million. I heard the collective gasp ripple through the room. I saw Tessa's face drain of all color. She had killed a man for a modest ranch house, never knowing she was standing next to an empire. I announced that from this day forward, every cent of profit generated by the trust would go into a new foundation. The Jacob Hartman Initiative would provide free vocational training for young people who wanted to learn to fix cars or build houses. It would fund the things my son loved. You killed my son because you thought he was your path to money, I said, looking her in the eye. but he was a bridge to something far greater than cash. You burned that bridge, Tessa, and the only thing you managed to reach is a prison cell. The judge did not hesitate. He sentenced Tessa Hartman to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He cited the clear financial motive and the cold calculation of the crime as aggravating factors. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the scratching of reporters' pens and the sound of chains rattling as the bailiffs pulled Tessa to her feet and led her away. When the heavy doors of the courthouse closed behind me, I stepped out onto the concrete steps of Riverton. The sun was shining, but the air was biting cold. I did not feel joy. There is no joy in burying a child. But the crushing weight on my chest felt lighter. I knew Jacob was never coming back, but the truth had been spoken. As I walked toward my car, I thought about the foundation and the work ahead. Tomorrow, I would start building again. It would be my way of speaking to him. A quiet, steady message sent from this world to the next. I had taken my revenge, but I had done it in a way that he would not be ashamed of if he were watching me from somewhere high above. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on the verdict. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit the like button, and smash that hype button to help this video reach more people. Your support means the world to me.